Hello, this is Alex Casares from Oracle, Arizona, and you are listening to The Candid Frame.
For the longest time, the story of how a photographer got their big break sounded pretty familiar. You would imagine a young photographer with a leather-bound portfolio visiting New York City. There they would visit editors and art directors, trying to make an impression that would hopefully lead to that career launching opportunity. Though that still may be part of some stories, the age of Instagram, websites, and email have resulted in different narratives. Taiwanese-born photographer Jessica Chow was aspiring to do editorial and commercial work, but was keeping ends meet by shooting weddings. But things began to change when one day she responded to an email.
I got this email from the editors looking, they needed a photographer, but, do you have a little bit more work? So I kind of had some where I did the second photography or little bits of photo from the wedding work, and kind of use that to kind of showcase just a little bit of extra stuff, just to show that documentary style. And then I got the job. They're like, hey, this is great. I think they want to go with you. By the way, this is for L'Oreal, Paris, shooting on commercial photo shoots. So that was my first job. So my first day of work was photographing behind the scenes with Gwen Stefani for an entire week, where she was this sort of the secret new talent that they were going to showcase.
Over the years, she has created a body of work that revolves around portraiture and documentary-style photography, all produced with a keen eye for color and gesture. But the learning curve for being a professional photographer had less to do with anything related to the camera and more about how to interact with people.
It's very psychological. We're managing a lot of different influences coming around. You have the expectations to want, you have the personal pressure to want to please the client. You have what's going on in front of you, which is their interaction with the talent. And then you have just a lot of you have PR people around you kind of with their agenda of what to do. So I think one of the main lessons that I had to come away with that was to try to control the environment, what was going to happen, to make it so that you learn to have to manage all the ingredients to make a successful shoot.
We'll talk to Jessica about how her return to Taiwan as an adult impacted her personally and creatively, and why she turned her camera on her home in the San Gabriel Valley for her personal project, Suburban Chinatown. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. Well, I talk a lot about your work, but one of the things I want to talk to you about to start with is about your grandmother. And she was a journalist back in China, or is it
Yes.
Taiwan? During what period was this? Was this the 70s?
No. This is
Before?
much long ago. So this was before the communist sort of takeover of the government.
Okay.
So my grandmother, she's from the northeast region of kind of northeast of Beijing. And from what I can, just the little bits of stuff that I know about it, it's that there's basically just women were not getting girls were not getting an education back then.
Right.
And so she was just one of the few girls who got an education, because the family had a little bit of money before an uncle, I think a relative, had gambled the money away. But up until that point, it was just something that I think my grandmother's mom had just known how useful it was to be able to read contracts or do things, and was just insisting that my grandmother would have an education along with her brother. So they would actually just walk miles and go to school and stuff. And so she, I think, got somehow got herself into getting a teacher's degree. Before she was married, there was a little paper, local newspaper, and she got hired to write a bunch of little newsletter reports, and that she was just one of the few women who had done that.
She was a Spitfire.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she's was a very modern woman back in her time.
Yeah, because it's amazing, even during that time, even if she wasn't working for a big newspaper, just the idea that a woman of that period would be going out talking to people and being a writer.
Yeah, exactly.
I think was really sort of extraordinary.
Yeah, I think it was just highly uncommon. I think my grandmother was really very like she would always tell me about this little story how like somebody was like saw her in the street. I think she had worn like, you know, little heels and had like a little cheap house dress like the and stuff, and somebody, and it was like probably like short sleeve and stuff, and I think somebody had like run up to her and passed a note to her saying that like you were a modern beauty. And so she was like very proud of that. Yeah.
Did you get to know much about her? Did you get these like stories and bits and pieces?
Yeah, definitely got like little bits of these stories and bits and pieces throughout the years. But I was very, very close to my grandmother. She actually lived with us in our house for like all of growing up. But I think just like a lot of the stuff about the past, you kind of hear it in passing very candidly through a conversation spontaneously. And I think the idea of like asking somebody about their history and past and stuff, it just doesn't sometimes really occur, I think, especially not in our family.
Yeah. I think it's really amazing and probably really encouraging when you hear of your own family members really making huge leaps in terms of what they choose to do with their lives, especially when you come from families that are very traditional, regardless of, you know, what the race or the culture is. And especially when you're young, I can imagine that that's really sort of inspiring to think that when things were much more difficult, that this person managed to make that a part of their lives.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Like, I think that when I was growing up, like just anything that I did, like if I traveled or did something, it was like my grandmother would sort of like emphasize to her friends. So we're like, oh, she's gone and traveled to like gone over the place. She's doing this and this. And I think it was just like these sort of like bits of encouragements, like that because of that. It was just that she had gone through this, and then she can recognize it in somebody else when they're trying to do things as well. And that getting that encouragement, it's super teeny tiny, but it makes a big difference.
Especially when it's your grandmother.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you were born in Taiwan, and then you came here when you were less than a year old?
Yeah. So my older sister, she was actually born here, but my mom went back to Taiwan to like have me because I think my grandmother was there at the time. And she just had some help, and then it was just like a matter of convenience to have me born in Taiwan.
So your parents were part of that big migration that happened during, I guess, was it the 70s or maybe earlier?
Yeah, so they kind of came over. My dad, he came over to go to graduate school. So basically both my parents, they went to the top universities in Taiwan. And my dad, he was studying the sciences. And to kind of like do your postgraduate studies, like you tend to go abroad. So he came out, and I think he went to, I think he came out for Stanford or Illinois, like I forget which school, but he came out for postgraduate studies.
Okay.
And he went to two different ones, which is why I don't know which one he came for first.
So that area, it was San Gabriel in the San Gabriel Valley, became the largest community of Chinese, both Chinese American and Chinese immigrants.
Yeah.
So did you largely grow up sort of in that sort of insular community for a good part of your childhood?
Yeah, basically my parents, after, my dad had done his post-studies and was trying to work and do stuff, I guess, learned about like Monterey Park, figured out that there's neighborhood existed, and was like moved over in the 90s, in the early 90s. So yeah, I did grow up in this very like Asian neighborhood with all the people who looked like me and spoke Mandarin.
I grew up in South LA, which is largely, at the time, African-American and Latino, probably around 50-50 around that time. Mm-hmm. That was pretty much the world that I knew. And outside of my relatives, like my aunts who lived in different parts of Los Angeles, like Hollywood and different pockets. And I think it wasn't until junior high school when I was part of the speech team that I began to discover different other parts of Los Angeles, especially the San Fernando Valley and the West Side and things like that. I was go to those different schools, and make quite an impression to me to realize that not only was Los Angeles that much bigger, but things were very different.
Yeah.
Right? Not only in terms of, what people look like, but the facilities they had access to, the resources. It was really just kind of blew my mind. And I was wondering, during your youth, do you remember a time when you did discover that there was a world outside of San Gabriel, Monterey Park?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think this the first thing that kind of comes to mind. It comes from like somebody who had kind of like as a kid, or one of my best friends growing up. She had moved back to Monterey Park from San Diego. So it wasn't so much that I had gone out and like saw something, but it was like more like somebody came back and brought something and told me about something else outside of Monterey Park. Mm-hmm. And she had come from San Diego, and I was she kind of went to a school that was very much like a white population. And it was just like kind of telling me these stories. And she kind of showed like when her first day of school, she showed up in like this like baby blue tennis dress and like jellies, like clear jelly shoes.
Yeah.
And it was just like super just wildly different from like what we were wearing in our school. And it was, I think we all kind of like noticed her and we're like, what is she doing? Who does she think she is? Like, what is all this? But, you know, it was like very much, but then I was also just completely intrigued by her. So I passed her a note just like, hey, do you want to be friends? Like in our classroom. And then it was from there where I started like, you know, learning about what was going on outside of Monterey Park, which seemed to me at the time very much like, oh, this is where the world is happening, but not here. Like that was sort of like that feeling that I had. It's like things I'm living here, but then if you want to participate in the world, it's like outside. And yeah, it's always felt like I was in a bubble. Yeah.
Did that sort of change when you went to East LA City College?
Yes. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think by that point I had already like started getting influences just outside. Like I was like really already at that point seeking other things that was not offered from my community, like just in terms of music and just culture, alternative culture and stuff. Yeah. And I think definitely from East LA College, it was sort of like, it sort of opened up a lot of like a different type of philosophy for me, or not so much a philosophy, but just people's attitude towards things. Like, I think I had always like had these bit of like philosophical questions that I would ask, but then people would just like, why are you like wondering about that? It doesn't matter. But when I kind of like found like in like the East LA community, or when I went into East LA and was around like more Latinos and just other people who were kind of more in the arts and stuff, it was just seemed like I suddenly found like I had a place to kind of grow from there.
I was reading that you had an appreciation for how Chicanos looked at their history and their culture, and that made a big impression on you. What was that about?
Yeah, I think it was just something about having like a sense of pride and like, you know, who they were as like a culture, and also just like it was this sort of like there was a fight for it as well, a fight to kind of preserve who they saw themselves at and to kind of have that like be represented and beautiful and also pretty distinct. And I think that was something that I had admired just like looking at it from the outside. And I think that was something that I was sort of like craving for in a way, to find a way to be proud of like where I had come from, and also just sort of like, but also just like disappointed that it just didn't seem like within the Asian community, we were pretty like vocal about that kind of expression. It was more of an admiration from that. But that kind of like gave me a place to sort of like explore this part that I wanted to sort of get out of myself. If that makes any sense.
Was it part of it the fact that because it was a largely sort of immigrant a community, that they were attempting to sort of assimilate, and I don't like that word assimilate, but basically sort of adopt all the trappings of what it means to be an American. So there was less of a need to feel like that sort of pride that Chicanos had, because the dynamic was very different. I think for Chicanos, part of the idea is that they felt like they were being denigrated for an integral part of themselves. And so claiming that Chicanismo was a way of sort of combating that, where maybe for Chinese immigrants, they weren't necessarily being diminished to that degree. So for them, that sort of combative nature of holding on to it wasn't as necessary. Do you think that may have sort of played a part in why one community sort of had that sort of aggressive adherence to its history, while with the Chinese community it was less so?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, the reason why I have a difficult time just like confirming that, like, it definitely is, there is parts of it where it's like you don't really feel, I think that just also having grown up in Monterey Park in the suburbs and in this type of community is that like a lot of the services and everything, we're kind of like, we're able to kind of grow a local economy just based off the fact that like everybody who kind of came into the suburbs came from a very like diverse set of backgrounds. Like it was different economic levels, different educational levels. So it was like already sort of like this built-in sort of diversity within the suburbs, that you were able to kind of really cater a community in that way and not really, and kind of sort of like, and keep it insular. So you kind of had a safe place to grow. And so, yeah, I think in that way, it's like there wasn't this feeling of like there was an outside oppression over the thing about just feeling like, so have not needing to sort of like fight that hard. But I also feel like the reason why I like struggle to just like wholeheartedly accept that is also because I think the way like Asians and like at least with Chinese people is going to be that the way you deal with conflict and everything, you don't talk about it out loud. It's just not a thing that you do. You keep everything like if you don't lose face outside, you don't bring that type of attention to yourself. So that's definitely another reason why.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, you transferred to UCLA and you got a degree in Middle East Studies.
Yes.
Is that right? So how did you take that and become a photographer? I think some people would look at that and go, okay, how does that fit?
Well, you know what? My mind is always a spaz, so it's kind of hard to keep up. But no, I actually went to UCLA and studied history with the intention of using that as my like backbone for journalism and photojournalism. And so that was sort of like, and I knew that UCLA had a great student newspaper. So I was like, okay, I could get my experience there, but I have my transfer credits where I can go to, and do this stuff and learn history, but history for me as an academic, like in terms of studies, has always been one of the easier subjects for me. So and I just have a natural inclination towards it. I just generally very interested in it. Normally I'm like kind of ADD, but if you put me in a history class, I tend to listen. So, which is odd. But the reason why I studied Middle East history was because 9/11 had just happened, like when I was in high school, sort of like, I guess maybe sophomore, junior year in high school. And suddenly everybody had opinions about it. And I think when you're young, you're like, we're ready to just kind of get out in the world and just kind of learn what's going on.
Yeah.
And so this was sort of like the place where I was finding a way to like channel my interest.
And you did an internship or something along those lines with television news?
Yeah, I did an internship with ABC 7 News as an online news producer. Yeah, but it was very short-lived. Like maybe a couple months. Yeah.
So your first photographic opportunity, I thought the story of how that happened was a very interesting one. So why don't you share that? Because I guess a lot of people wonder, how do you get in? Because just having the degree alone doesn't give you entry to anything. But yours is kind of fascinating in terms of how that happened. Yes.
So I had like graduated from UCLA, and I had like a little like bit of work that I made from being at the paper, the Daily Bruin. And then there was this there's this platform where it was like kind of like this forum for reporters and photojournalists to sort of share information and show their portfolio. So it was like a little bit janky. My portfolio was like super janky. It was just like this little photojournalism-y portfolio that I had. It was maybe like 10 images. And one day I got an email from an editor working at SEPA from the corporate division to do if I was available for like a shoot. They needed somebody. They didn't tell me what it was about.
And SEPA is?
SEPA Press they're kind of like a newswire service, very similar to Associated Press in the U.S. And so it was like, but that was in the French counterpart, I guess, or its own agency in France. And so it was just like this. And at that time, I had been working for a wedding photographer in L.A. And so she also had come from like a photojournalism background. So there was like all of this little bits of stuff. And it was just this, I got this email from the editor they needed a photographer, but, do you have a little bit more work? So I kind of had like some like where I did the second photography or like little bits of photo from like the wedding work, and kind of use that to kind of like showcase just a little bit of extra stuff just to like show that documentary style.
Right.
And then I got the job. They're like, hey, this is great. Like, I think they want to go with you. By the way, this is for L'Oreal Paris, shooting on commercial photo shoots. So that was like my first job. So my first day of work was photographing behind the scenes with Gwen Stefani for like an entire week, where she was like this sort of the secret new talent that they were going to showcase. And that was how that went. They had said at the time, like, if you do well, it could lead to more work. So it was just...
Yeah, no pressure.
I mean, I didn't sleep the entire night, but like the entire time the night before. And like, it was just like a fish out of water, complete fish out of the water. It was just like, first of all, I've never had an assignment before that. And then, I show up at like Milk Studios of like this legendary Hollywood, like, entertainment place. And everybody just seems to know exactly where to be. So I just try to look for, like, the person that looks important and go and introduce myself to the president of L'Oreal Paris, which was, like, completely, like, embarrassing. But, yeah, that's how that went.
And obviously it went well.
Yeah. So I was very lucky that I was working with a behind-the-scenes crew on that. So I was just kind of sort of, like, found some people that were, like, not, basically was just kind of just fit right into that group of people that was doing the behind the scenes. And it just sort of, like, watched them, how they did it, and just followed suit and learned from there. It was an amazing experience.
Man, that's quite a way to jump into a pool. I mean, seriously, because it's not just about making the photographs. Everyone sort of fixates about making the photographs, but so much of it is about just negotiating the various people, right? Especially when you got executives there. It's like you got the crew there, you got the executives there, you have the minders there, and you're there trying to take pictures.
Yeah.
And especially if you're green like that, it's just like there's so much they have to think about, right? It's amazing that you came out without freaking out too much, or at least freaking out and not showing it.
Well, you know what? It's just I just didn't know enough of what I was getting myself into. So I think that was my saving grace, probably.
Ignorance can be bliss. Yeah.
And I think it's just like and I think it was just like I had the team of people to kind of watch how they did things, and they were also just had the very similar, like, attitude and vibe that I just sort of, like, felt a place I was just able to fit right in. So that was, like, made it a bit of a soft landing for me. And I think also just, like, being on set there, the people there, they've, like, been on set for a really long time. So they already have, it's like there's, like, coded languages everywhere, and they tell you very quickly when you're out of line. So you just learn very quickly when you're in that setting and when you're giving them up. But I mean, for the very long time, I was still very, like, just, deer in headlights, just like, oh no, there's Gwen Stefani. She's looking at the camera. Turn around.
Were you able to leverage that almost immediately, or did it take some time to sort of build on that?
Yes, so I was able to. So I kind of worked on it for the first 6 months. I just didn't have huge, like, entry into any editors or any understanding of how to even approach people. But from there, it was just like, okay, well, I started, because that was the only thing that was going on for me. It was just like, I started looking for all, like, the clippings where things were being published at or how they were being used, and just kind of gathering them. And then after like 6 months, just made it like a whole sort of, like, little, like, PDF of the stuff that I had done. So one of the videographers I was working with on the L'Oreal stuff, his, like, I guess now ex-wife, was the photo director for Hollywood Reporter. And so from there, I was able to kind of, like, bring that work over and show her what I was doing. And there was at that time a very direct need for what she was looking for. And so I was able to use that, show it to her. And then also because she had known that I was working with her ex-husband and, like, a whole team of people that was just, she just already could, it was like a built-in trust there. Yeah.
And trust is at the heart of all that kind of work. Once you've demonstrated that you're capable of photographer, it's the other thing is, are you someone that I can work with and that I like?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So your aunt played a different role in another aspect of your career, but when you had the chance, which led to your chance to go back to Taiwan as an adult.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
So I had graduated from UCLA. My aunt knew about that. She was really happy about it, but she was like, okay. And she had actually been part of, like, the publishing industry in Taiwan. So she worked for a magazine. I think she was doing HR for what would be like the counterpart to The Economist magazine. So it's called Tiansha Zazhi, and it's a Commonwealth magazine. They were working. They were doing a special projects series with one of like a cultural critic in Taiwan. So it was just sort of like this thing where it's like, okay, maybe we can create a little, like, internship for you to come and just sort of, like, use what you learn from college and apply that here, and also just use this as the opportunity to kind of, like, get you to understand where your family comes from, a little bit of history. So it's like, which was, like, tremendous. I mean, so the apartment that we still have in the family that I got to stay in was actually the apartment that my dad grew up in. So
wow.
Yeah. So it was like really nice. So it was like in that way, it's just sort of kind of like in the same setting that he had grown up in, and you go outside, the same like, little like Taiwanese breakfast stand is still there. So I would get breakfast there as well. And it was just like using this opportunity to like do little bits of like street photography when I was there, and then joining them on like the cultural critic that they were doing the special projects around. Like it was about the anniversary of the Communist Revolution. And so all the people who had fled from China into Taiwan, and it was like this anniversary book on it called 1949.
That seems like a rich time, both photographically and personally, as you were sort of kind of rediscovering your family, your roots, but at the same time, you're getting to see it through the eyes of being a photographer.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, I feel like I was still very young and very new to everything. And just like, I just also didn't really know how to be a photographer at that time. Mm-hmm. It was just like, what do I do? How do I do this? And then, so it was a bit of like a confusing moment for me, and like as a photographer or attempting to become a photographer at that point. But it was definitely like a really great place where I was just being able to kind of see the place where I was born in, but never had gone back to until that point. And then it was just like a chance where nobody else out there also knew me. So I kind of just started like, just try a bunch of things just to see who I was, what I can be. And that was, it was definitely like, it's always very mixed. Like I always feel like I do one thing, I come out with one thing, but I do like something complete opposite. So it's like really kind of always a bit hard for me to understand why these things come together, but it's just, yeah.
Well, I think there's an advantage to making a choice like that, because especially when you're not sure, that making those extreme choices allows you to settle into a place that is right for you, rather than trying to basically take a round peg and put it in a square hole.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people struggle with finding that niche for themselves, because they don't take the risk of experimenting.
Yeah.
And they're merely mirroring what other people are doing, which is right for them, but not necessarily for the person who's trying to create something for themselves. So what you're describing, I think, is a healthy way of doing it, even though you kind of go in blind at the beginning.
I mean, it's funny because it's like there's one part of me that's always, that when I learned that you can be a photographer, that's a profession, I was like, all right, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. But then there's the other part of me was just like, well, like, how do I do that? Why does this make sense to me? And then that's the sort of like part where I'm just trying to learn and experience it, and kind of like find a way to just marry these two things in a way that feels authentic to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When did you start feeling that portraiture was going to be a big part of what you wanted to do as a photographer?
I definitely think it kind of comes out of my want to feel more of a collaborator versus an observer.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so I come from a documentary background, photojournalism background, but I think I always had these sort of like bits where it wasn't necessarily straight observation. Like they were, like I was trying to make sense of it. And then I also wanted to kind of like have like, not just be a fly on the wall and just capture what was in front of me. It was like, well, I have an opinion. I have an idea. Is there a way where we can both collaborate? And it kind of, I use that in portraiture and in like the documentary or work as well, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes sense.
Yeah.
When you started doing it for editorial work, talk about some of the early challenges, some of the things that you had to learn when photographing people on assignment, be they celebrities, politicians, people that were being profiled for articles. I know a lot of people want to ask about lighting and stuff, and I go, yeah, everybody can figure that out well enough. But the dynamics of working with a subject and working with an editor are an important skill. And I'm wondering what for you was what was essential for you to learn in order for you to be able to do it effectively and earn a living?
Yeah, I think just the whole editorial photography, doing portraiture, it's very psychological. It's very psychological. We're managing a lot of like different influences coming around. You have the expectations to want, like you have the personal pressure to want to please the client. You have like what's going on in front of you, which is their interaction with the talent. And then you have just like a lot of you have PR people around you kind of like with their agenda of what to do. So I think one of the main lessons that I had to come away with that was to try to control the environment, what was going to happen, to make it so that like you learn to have to manage all the ingredients to make a successful shoot.
That's an important one for me.
Yeah.
Because for me, it's I feel like I have to establish that this is my house.
Yeah.
Right? That this is my house and everyone here is here on my invitation, and being confident enough to do that. Because once you surrender control of that to anyone else, be it the subject, be it the manager, be it whoever it is, that your ability to be able to do what you need to do is made all the more difficult. And it can be hard, especially when you're young, to give yourself permission to take that level of control. But I think to some degree, everyone is expecting you to. And even the people who give you pushback want to feel like you're in control. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think that it is that with portraiture sometimes it's that you are taking a portrait of somebody else. And so then there is this thing about, well, if this is what's going to happen here. And you want to feel like the person who's going to take the photograph is going to, they want to feel like, okay, this person has an idea and that whatever they're executing is that everybody's on board with what's about to happen. And I think that sometimes they have an image where they want to have a show somebody happy. Well, it's well, then you then have to start saying, well, sure, I'm going to allow you to kind of give me your presentation and show me what you think you want to offer. But I also need to kind of take a step back here and just kind of show the sort of the humanity, the human side behind all of this that kind of delivers what you're trying to do. And I think that, sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. And I think it's not always about us pushing somebody's personality out for them, but it's just more this sort of collaboration that's happening to kind of make something honest of the moment. And that's outside of this PR push as well. Yeah.
To be the voice that introduces the episode like Alex Caceres did this week, just send us an audio file recorded on your phone, tablet, or computer saying something like, "This is Tom Joad from Sallisaw, Oklahoma, and this is The Candid Frame." Say it at least a couple of times so we have a take to choose from, and include 3 to 4 seconds of silence with your voice to help us clean up the audio. Also, make sure to include a link to your website, blog, or Instagram feed when you send it to info@thecandidframe.com.
Help The Candid Frame to continue bringing you great conversations with some of the world's best photographers. You can do this by supporting our Patreon effort by committing as little as $5 or more a month. When you do this, you not only help us to meet the cost of production, but provide us the time and resources we need to bring you conversations you won't hear anywhere else. Sign up today by visiting patreon.com/thecandidframe. Thank you.
Is the pitching of the idea for you, is it largely happening the day of the shoot, or are you going back and forth with the people before they arrive at the studio in terms of conveying what the concept is for the shoot?
It's both. Sometimes it just depends on what type of shoot is happening. Sometimes if it's a little bit more stylized and there's a little bit more of want to do something, there's a back and forth. There's a lot of stuff where it's okay, well, I see this on him and I think there's something that I respond to here and I think that we can kind of show it in this light. What do you think? And then they kind of all say yes at first, and then slowly one by one they kind of start tearing apart. So it's just okay, well, it's you sort of learn to just kind of manage that conversation to kind of figure out the best things where it's give and take to kind of create the best environment for the photo shoot. But the other stuff, there's also times where we get the call day before and you have to show up and it's like you only have like 5 to 10 minutes for the shoot. It's like, well, so you only have like sometimes just like this moment beforehand. It's like, all right, you kind of like have an idea of how you're going to approach it. Like just recently I photographed Mark Zuckerberg. You know, that was like a very, like, we didn't have too much of an idea of what the interview or story is going to be about. So it was just in my head, it's like, well, how do I even think about this? What do I do? And so I can have like a conceptually of just like of what I think I might want to get out of that shoot of like, or what I think I can see about who he is. That sort of like, and then and so from there is just kind of getting an idea of what the space we have, what does that look like? So that kind of like also dictates how I'm going to think about what's possible. Because if the room's very light and airy, then maybe the type of lights or the setting that I bring up just kind of completely sets a different mood and stuff. So this is just sort of like, yeah, I think you kind of like just really run as fast as you can sometimes with like the short amount of time and kind of have a conceptual background to kind of at least have something to fall back onto.
Did you have any sense about where you were going to photograph going in?
Well, I knew we were going to be at the Facebook headquarters, and I had been there before, so I kind of knew what it looked like, but I didn't, and I knew we were going to have like a little bit of like a studio stage. I just didn't know what that looked like.
Okay.
But I figured, I think at that point it was just like, okay, I'm going to kind of go with something just a little bit like, because I think just what has been going on with Facebook and over the last like several years, it's just the fact that like, we had actually done the photo shoot a year from like a year to the date from his court hearing the year before. So it's just like, okay, we're not going to try to make this big, airy, like light photograph, given like what's going on with Facebook. We're going to try to like kind of have this fit with the times. And I think that that's sort of like a deeper lighting scenario was more effective there.
And when I photograph someone, I often have the flexibility of being able to find the location that, because of light and background, I can sort of move them to. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure that you have faced situations where you don't have the flexibility or the option to be able to do that you're given them not only a finite period of time, but a very limited space in which to create the photograph.
Yeah.
You know? So can you tell me about one of the more challenging situations you've been faced with and how you sort of came up with a solution for that?
Oh, okay. Well, here's one. There is this one time where I was on a photo shoot for Billboard magazine just recently, and we were photographing. It was like they were holding an industry night, so they kind of showcase some like fresher, newer talents, and they're doing a little performance for the members of Soho House. And so the Soho House, like you basically, so it's like, okay, so it's like in that scenario, so like, you know that it's going to be like a very quick scenario. It's on the fly. It's going to be like, grab whatever you can. Maybe you only have 5 minutes with them before the show, something like that. But to make things even like more challenging and more exciting is that like the Soho House is like, you cannot have any photography at the place. So it's basically because I was trying to like, okay, we're going to do the Soho House. So I was like kind of doing a little bit of research just to kind of see what images are out there. And there's like just no images unless it's like put out by the Soho House. And so I show up and we were talking to the, I guess who's the talent manager or like the PR person. It was just like, yes, but you know, okay, we can't have any photography. You can't do it. Like they're going to be performing. So it's okay if you have your camera then, but anything else, we just can't make it look like you're taking any portraits. So any of the stuff, like you can't have it. And it was just like, he said it in this happy tone that was just like really upbeat. And I was just like, you're slowly tearing my soul apart right now, but for some reason I feel fine. And at the very end, he was just like, this is going to be awesome. And I was just like, is it really? But I think it was just like in that sort of case, like you're just completely just limited with anything. And so, but you still have to produce something. So
right.
It's like, what are you going to do? So you just kind of have to start finding a bunch of scenarios where it's like, it's very discreet. Nobody's going to be around to see you. And you just sort of like strip any sense of like, details around. So in that case, it was just like, if I saw a light coming through a window and it was just shining the spotlight on, then I knew that, okay, well, I can just darken everything in the background and just kind of focus on the face. So a lot of it was just sort of like, all right, all these photos are going to be super tight. Like, you're going to tight headshots, which is not a bad thing. I'm happy with that to do so, but it's just whenever you start like doing that. And then there's like other parts of it where it's like maybe there's a slight like maybe 15 minutes where we had like a little bit of a green room in the place before it's going to be transformed to open to everybody. So we was able to use a little bit of that. Yeah. And I think it was just sort of getting really creative with like what we were managing. Like at some point there, it was just like, oh, there's a photo booth that's the only part of the Soho House that actually gets out into the public. So we're like, okay, we're taking over. So we're using it. I'm pretty sure Soho Houses might not be like happy about saying any of this. So maybe hopefully they don't hear it. But yeah, it was just like, we just sort of like took over and just kind of manned it. And
you got to make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your editor is not interested in excuses.
No. And it's like the worst thing is just like to see that like, okay, all these restrictions happen and then I couldn't get it. But then there's a photographer who goes the next day and does all this stuff. It's like, oh no, it's like, no, it's like something needs to come out of it. And I think that was like a very big adrenaline rush. And I was like thoroughly happy with what I was able to produce out of that. But it's not always successful. And then it's just like, when it's not successful, you just kind of go back and look at the photos and you just like figure out like, how am I going to make this work? How do I spin this?
Well, it seems like you've gotten good at it during those moments.
It's like over experience. It's just over time. There's more you deal with it. It's just like, you just have to come up with something. And
yeah,
I think the pressure of like being able to come up with that, it's like, you kind of meet it a little bit more. You're kind of up for the challenge just a little bit more, but you're also kind of get older and a little bit grumpier and like just sort of like need like ask me for certain things to make things happen, or otherwise like, if I can't do a good job, then I don't want to be out there.
Yeah, welcome to one of the benefits of getting older. So you kind of go back to your sort of documentary photojournalism roots with your project in San Gabriel.
Yes, so I do.
How did that come about, and what inspired you to not move away from portraiture, but to have an alternative way to express your interest in photography?
I mean, I would say that was like always my original interest in photography, like the documentary stuff or the documentary style aspect, and sort of being able to look at the world and try to understand what sort of events that kind of, or what sort of, events or environments that sort of like create how we understand our experience. So that was always my interest in photography. But that whole entire project stemmed out of like a place when I was feeling really creatively frustrated editorially. So when I started shooting for L'Oreal and doing all these like behind the scenes, like documentary style backstage work, and then kind of applying that into then more of the editorial work, I hadn't really defined who I was as a photographer to myself. Like I knew I had these interests. I knew like I had this background and interest in photojournalism, but then I found myself in a space that I had never intended myself for. And then feeling like being dictated, or not dictated so much, but just sort of like being pulled in many different directions of trying to please clients or like kind of get these sort of images that I wasn't sure if I was responding to. So I had reached a point where I was like feeling very like frustrated and wanting to like kind of see something out of my work that I felt like it was going to be for myself. So when I started going out shooting in Monterey Park, it started out as like just like me going out in the street and just practicing my aesthetic and just sort of practicing like giving some worth and attention to things that was catching my eyes in the periphery, and then just like allowing myself to just be interested in that and to kind of create an image that I thought could be, that was like, that I always wanted to see out of my images, but never was able to achieve. So that was like it stemmed out of that. But there was this one day where I was stepping out of my apartment balcony, and then I had looked out into this scene of like, it was this man who was just had on a stepladder, like putting up like these, like, I guess like maybe these like shades, from outside, like these bamboo shades. And it's just like this landscape that was just like, for me, it completely just suddenly clicked in my head that like where I was growing up in, like that it was the suburb, but it was like Asian people and doing these things that were like I think growing up, like I had always like imagined that the narrative of the US was at large, and everything that was happening in Monterey Park or in the San Gabriel Valley was just completely out of touch. And it was just like one moment where I like saw this scene that where like those two things suddenly snapped together. Whereas it was like I saw our community as part of something larger and a like larger narrative. And it was just this. I mean, it was such a like a classic like suburban scene where somebody's like taking care of their home in front of their house, like these like very very quintessential like symbols of the American dream. And it was just something that I was just like, oh, okay, well, here's something that I just didn't know, that I had never seen my neighborhood or observed it in that way. And that was like a very like, and that's sort of like where I'm always coming back to with the work, like what I'm always trying to chase after. It's like, how do we fit in with the larger narrative in the US? Like, how do we belong?
What I really like about your work is that it opens up a Los Angeles that was always on my periphery, but that I never really considered. And your images do that for me. I grew up in Los Angeles all of my life. And when I take a look at your photographs, I see things that I go, that's LA. Like in some of your images, you have the strip malls that pervade Los Angeles. But then you have the signage. In Chinese script. You have the little decorations. You see these elements in which the people of that community make that aspect that is everywhere in Los Angeles, but you see that twist.
Yes.
How they're sort of making it their own. And sometimes those elements are probably very subtle. Some I pick up on, but I'm sure that there are others that for people who grew up in that area, they see it and they go, I know that.
Yeah.
Was that part of the appeal of exploring and making photographs, being able to make photographs that weren't necessarily sort of heavy-handed in terms of what they were trying to say, but sort of creating its own visual interpretation of what life in the LA experience is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of that just kind of stems from exactly how I've experienced growing up. Because I draw a lot about that, which is like, everything feels like, yes, it's the same. It's like, there's nothing too much different. But then there's always that bit of twist. Like, there's this image of a woman who's standing in front of her house and she's wearing an Abercrombie with the Abercrombie bag, which is like, it's like this sort of this thing where it's like, you're kind of seeing in a setting that feels very typical. Feels very like, oh yeah, you probably walked by one of these places before. But you're seeing somebody who's wearing Abercrombie, which is like very like, obviously quintessential American brand of like retail and fashion and but it's like put together in a way that is like very non-American to me. Like the colors, it's like a pink top with yellow pants and a green jacket. And even the way she's like holding herself and presenting herself, it's like a gesture that kind of like feels very, it just feels like very like unique on its own. It's like its own thing. And it's like something that I think kind of shows more of these sort of mannerisms that kind of shape how we experience.
Yeah, it's a mashup of all the different cultures.
Yeah.
Like in one photograph.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's the part where it's like, I never want to kind of be like, oh, this is who we are. This is how we want to be seen as our inspirations of our, like not that type of thing, but it's just sort of like all these, how these sort of like mashups sort of line up and then disalign.
Right.
Yeah. And it's sort of like this feeling of constant, just sort of like, it's always like evolving. I think there's like this feeling of evolving all the time. And you're taking on something and you're trying to go after something, but you kind of see where things don't quite connect, but then kind of like form into like, but it almost feels like you're forming something new together. And I think that that's the bit where it's like probably the reason why I don't want to make it so obvious. But there is always this feeling of familiarity, and then it's like something throws you off kilter.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's coming from a very personal place plays an important part in it.
Yeah, like when I was growing up and thinking about photojournalism, I had always thought I was going to like go and become a conflict photographer and think about what's going on in the Middle East. But it's just like, well, here I am photographing my home, which is like furthest away, like the closest furthers away of that idea. And the whole thing about that, I think, is like this, well, before I go out and try to understand or try to say what's going on with something else, like, where am I coming from? Who am I? Like, why do these things that, like, I pay attention to, like, what is it about that makes me who I am?
Yeah.
And I think that that's the question that I've always, like, probably been trying to answer. One of the things about, like, my family history and stuff, like, I think my, I don't know my family's history past my grandparents. And even then, like, it's just that one bit of history that I was able to tell you about my grandmother, growing up, like, having an education and being a journalist. Like, that's probably one of, like, just a teeny tiny fragment of all I have of a past, in my family. Like, otherwise, like, my grandmother was, like, 80 for, like, as long as I knew her. She was always 80 years old. So I think there's always this feeling of, like, this not having a past and not really knowing where things are coming from. And I think there's a desire to want to, like, figure out, well, how do I plant my roots here?
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
One of the things I admire about the work is you're photographing in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
And as a street photographer, I know how difficult it is to photograph in the suburbs, especially in Los Angeles, where everybody is in their car and virtually nobody walks on a sidewalk.
Yeah.
And I look at the work, and because I've driven through there, I've walked through there, and the neighborhoods like that.
Yeah.
And I find it one of the greatest challenges as a photographer, photographing in the public space, is in communities like that. Because if you go to Venice or you go to Hollywood or you go to downtown Los Angeles, it's like shooting fish in a barrel sometimes. But you go into a suburb and it's just difficult. So how do you sort of tell me about how you make that work for yourself?
Well, I mean, it was really, really hard in the beginning. Like, I think that when I was starting it, it's just like you're in the suburbs, and especially with even in a, like, Chinese, like, community or an Asian community that's, like, already very insular. Mm-hmm. It's like the act of, like, hey, can I, snoop around and take your photo or something like that is just like, it's like very, very, very suspicious. So in the beginning, like, it was really hard. Every day I went out, I felt like everybody wanted to, like, was just going to bark at me and get mad at me and yell at me, or just be like, what are you doing this for? Like, I remember this one time I found, like, this, like, lawn bowling club and was like, oh, I want to try to see what I can capture out of this. And then one of the ladies was just like, don't you know that you have to, like, do all this stuff? It's too much work. And it was just, like, kind of diminishing, like, this whole, like, this is useless. Why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. But then every 10 of those interactions, there was always going to be, like, one that was just like, oh, they see the value in, like, capturing the story. And so it was like those moments where it's just like, okay, well, I guess here's one more. Let me move on and try to get the next one. Okay. So that's how it kind of was in the beginning. And I think where you're in the streets in the suburb is just like everybody's sort of like doing their own thing. Nobody's like, so to suddenly just see somebody kind of like paying attention to you, you're just like, I did not ask for this. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky balance to try to, like, find a way to get them to pay attention to you in a way that's not antagonistic. And I feel like when I was younger and starting it, I was less sure about what I was actually after. But now that going back into it, I think, maybe it's because I feel like I'm going in with a bit of a more purpose. So it's easier for me to explain. It's easier to get people on board with me. And that, I feel like, has really changed a lot of the interactions with what I'm able to capture. And I think that, just having this sense of purpose and then feeling like the person who I'm photographing or doing something. I think the thing is, like, if people feel like they don't understand what your intentions are, it's like it's like, okay, well, if you don't get it, then I'm really suspicious. Because then I can't make up my mind.
So what's your elevator pitch when you meet somebody that you want to photograph and they ask you, what is it for?
Oh, well, yes, I say I'm doing a project about daily life in the San Gabriel Valley. And then I say that I'm trying to show how the community is settling its roots in the area. And most of the time, there's like, oh, okay, that's cool. That sounds great. Other times, though, like, there's also moments like that I guess I'm thinking about that image again with the woman in Abercrombie. But that was like a moment where it's just like, I turned around, I saw her, and it was just like a very like, sort of like quick engagement of like, oh, can I take a photo? So it was like already there and a built-in understanding that I was like kind of doing something that was like, okay, we can understand what's happening. It's like it's kind of unspoken, but it's like, then you can take that photo, you know? Yeah.
I read that you showed the work to an editor who didn't get it. I think it was in the article that I read in Aperture magazine.
Oh, okay.
And that it just kind of went over their heads. Do you remember that? Or
I think it's sort of like the nuances of like why this image over another image and what these things are doing, what the sort of dynamics is trying to like maybe very subtly, maybe it's too subtle sometimes, but trying to like to show why these dynamics are important to show. And yeah,
because I think some people may just look at it within the trappings of it's yet another suburb, which if a person came from a suburban upbringing, even if it isn't within a Chinese community, they see those things and they immediately sort of write it off. It's like, this isn't special. I see it all the time. I live that.
Yeah.
But, you're bringing a slightly different skew, and I guess it takes a little bit of education.
Yeah, I think so.
In order for them to sort of pick up that, like you say, it's much more nuanced, much more subtle what you're doing.
And I think that it really does demand you to sit down and pay attention and to really look at these little bits of pieces. So it's like, it's definitely not going to be a quick Instagram scroll. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it definitely kind of like puts you in a place where you're going to have to see, well, like nothing's really happening, but what is this like? What is it that you're kind of showing here? And why is there this feeling? And so it's a very slow photograph. It's very slow.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate slow. Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Somebody who I recently discovered maybe about a year ago is a photographer. She's based in London, and her name is Teresa Ng. And she just is where she's putting out a book called China Dream. And I think it has been recognized as shortlisted for Aperture Portfolio Prize. And her work, she deals with sort of like identity fragment, like fractured identity. And she's kind of like looking at China from the perspective of somebody who grew up in a diaspora and what sort of like that means to her. And sort of like, kind of like just, I mean, it should probably be better if she just said it, but just sort of like, to me, it's just sort of like kind of like the perception of China is sort of the things that are like what's actually happening, how she's like figuring that out together. And I think that that's like something that's sort of like almost to me feels like a counterpart of a counter narrative to what I'm doing at home in like the suburbs. It's like just sort of like how we're sort of settling this identity that's been sort of like displaced and then putting back together again.
Oh, I look forward to checking that out. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for making time for me. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me on the show. I mean, I'm a big fan, so thank you very much.
Thanks to Jessica for sharing her time and story with us. You can find out more about her and her work by visiting jessicachowphotography.com. My latest book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow, is now available. Purchase it today and receive 40% off the list price when you order it from the Rocky Nook website. Use the promo code Pirello40 at checkout to take advantage of the discount. And receive 3 free copies of my previously published ebooks by signing up for the Candid Frame mailing list, where I share thoughts about life, photography, and keep you updated on all things the Candid Frame. If you enjoy the show, help to spread the word by writing a review wherever you find and listen to podcasts. And if you write a review on a blog post, let me know and send me a link because I would really like to thank you on air. Thanks to Secular Pilgrim, Photo 2013, and Dennis Thibault for their positive reviews. You can support this show by making a monthly contribution through Patreon or you can make a one-time contribution via PayPal. You'll find the links for both in the show notes and the website. Thanks to Stuart Westmore, Paul Martin Patura, Martin Branch, Costas Blachuras, and Giselle Duprez for their recent contributions. Thank you so much. And if you want to easily access every episode of The Candid Frame, download the Candid Frame app. It's available for both Apple iOS and Android, and it's free. And if you scroll down on the app, you'll find a free excerpt of my book that you can download. And we also have an Alexa app, so if you have one of those smart devices, download the skill and listen to the show that way. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.